Welcome. Today is Israel's 75th birthday, a miracle we commemorate and celebrate in gratitude. In honor of Yom Ha'azmaut, Georgetown University professor Ori Z Soltes speaks about Benno Elkan and the definition of Israeli art. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. It is my pleasure to introduce Ori Soltes, who teaches at Georgetown University across a range of disciplines, from art history and theology to philosophy and political history. He's the former director of the Bnei Brit Kluznik National Jewish Museum and has curated more than 90 exhibitions across the country and overseas. He has authored or edited 25 books and several hundred articles and essays. Recent volumes include Our Sacred Signs, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, The Ashen Rainbow, Essays on the Arts and the Holocaust, Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, and Growing Up Jewish in India, Synagogues, Ceremonies, and Customs from the Bnei Israel to the Art of Siona Benjamin. After the talk, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the chat or Q&A section. Welcome, Ori. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here. As always, anything with the Fritz Ascher Society is a pleasure, but particularly doing the Zoom program. Yes, it is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel, but what we might call Israeli art, in a very obvious sense, has a history that goes back another half a century, because the question of how to create what eventuates as Israeli art was already being raised much earlier. And I'm going to share screen and start with an image and take it from there. Are you all seeing this image? It's the Arch of Titus, or a detail from it rather, and you can see it's the 7-branched candelabra. I am going to make it larger for a few. That's going to digitalize it a bit, but you at least can see it more clearly. 7-branched menorah, you can see that it's got a frond kind of stem, which style dates from the Achaemenid Persian period, which is the period when the second temple was built, the Judean temple, as opposed to the first, the Israelite temple that Solomon built. And at the base, you can see there are zodiac motifs. I'm speculating that that was added when Herod the Great, the Idumean king of Judea, between 37 and 4 BCE, did refurbishments of the temple, expanded the Temple Mount. The retaining wall is what we now call the Western Wall, for example, that he added. And he was obsessed with Hellenistic and Roman art and its motifs, among them the zodiac, and so he probably added that base. There's an irony, of course, that we see this image of it on the underside of the Arch of Titus that records the eventual conquest of Judea, or rather the suppression of the Judean revolt against Roman power between 65 and 70 CE that culminated with the destruction of the temple. The irony is that this symbol, for a variety of reasons that I won't go into except the obvious one, that it, by synecdoche, the part representing the whole, represents the temple, that this would become the quintessential symbol of what we might call, or in what we might call, Jewish art over the centuries. So, for example, this is from the 5th century. It's the bottom of a glass, a large glass that was found in the Jewish catacombs outside Rome. It dates from the Byzantine period, and you can see that it has a kind of representation of the tabernacle, the parochet, the curtain being pulled apart, and not one but 2 7-branched candelabra, perhaps representing the first and second temples, perhaps representing the temple of the past and the hoped for messianic temple of the future. And there are scores and scores of works of art that we can follow through the centuries, right down to the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, where the quintessential symbol that is used in what we might call Jewish art is this seven-branch candelabrum. Not, by the way, the six-pointed star. That is a relatively late addition, as it were, to this vocabulary of what is specifically Jewish. All of which brings me to the end of the 19th century, when in the context of a range of nationalist movements, both across Europe and burgeoning also within the Middle East, there of course developed a Jewish nationalist movement, aka Zionism, and we associate a very specific articulation of ambition to create a Jewish polity with Theodor Herzl and his work called The Jewish State, and the first Zionist Congress that he organized in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. But very quickly, the Zionist leadership engaged in a debate about precisely what the ambitions should be for a Jewish nationalist idea. And whereas Herzl favored a political idea and sought as solving the problem that Jews subject to anti-Semitism had no place to go. So this would be a kind of redemptive enterprise. On the other hand, people like Ahad Ha'am said, that's not the issue, buddy. You come from the West. I come from Tsarist Russia. We've been oppressed. We've been beaten. We've been killed again and again, and we survived. What we need is a redemptive spiritual rejuvenation, because the fragmentation in the modern era of Judaism into diverse Judaisms, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, and a whole series of subsets among those is a danger to us. And a subset of Ahad Ha'am's idea of spiritual Zionism was the cultural Zionism that, among others, Martin Buber promoted. He said, look, if the Jewish nationalist idea is to be full-fledged and three-dimensional, it has to include the arts. It has to include music, dance. It has to include visual art, which has not really been easily accessible for Jews over the millennia of diaspora. So that should be an ambition. And the guy who, in a practical way, promoted this was Boris Schatz, the, at that time, recent court sculptor and painter to Ferdinand, the King of Bulgaria. And as Bulgaria attained its independence from the Ottoman Empire, it was Schatz's job to try and formulate what could be called Bulgarian national art. So he, when he became interested in Zionism, thought, I can formulate a Jewish national art, not simply the art of Jews as a religion or as an ethnicity, or even in a certain sense as a nation, as a culture, but as a nation. And so the outcome of that was the establishment of the Bezalel School that opened its doors in 1906. And we observe two things as part of this early development. This is half a century before the state. One is that when the state will finally be established by 1948, as we're commemorating today, what becomes the state seal is that very seven-branched candelabrum, not just but the. You recognize it's the very one we saw on the Arch of Titus with the word Israel in Hebrew below it and olive branches flanking it. So that becomes not just what had been the most frequent symbol across the millennia of Jewish dispersed art, but the symbol of symbols of the state of Israel itself. That's going to happen half a century down the road. Backing up to the time of Bezalel that opened its doors to repeat in 1906, there was a whole group of artists whom Schatz ingathered, mostly from different parts of Europe, largely Central and Eastern Europe at that point, among them Ephraim Moses Lillian, who was a renowned printmaker. And here we see a work from about 1910 that depicts Moses, Lillian's namesake. He's Ephraim Moses Lillian, in German, hence M-O-S-E, not M-O-S-E-S. And I call your attention to details of the image. He's got the rising sun behind him, a Zionist symbol, but of course it also functions as a kind of halo. But you understand that the word halo comes from the Greek word helios, meaning sun. He wears the kind of crown that in Assyrian art, gods wore. The face looks like the face of Theodor Herzl. He towers with his, well, it's not the tablets of the law, it is the tablets of the law, but it's also kind of Herzl's treatise on the Jewish state that he bears before him. So Herzl is the image of Moses. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery, into freedom, out of exile to the promised land. Herzl is doing the same thing 33, 34, 35 centuries later. That's the kind of idea. So Bezalel art functioned in terms of a vocabulary of symbols, a vocabulary of subjects, certain stylistic elements, and it's really the beginning of what we would call Israeli art. Even more so, we see the first development of public statuary, and this is a work by Abraham Melnikov. He was a Bessarabian Jew. It's the Monuments to the Fallen at Tel Chai, and it dates from 1934. And I call your attention to three issues here. One, it is an impressive public sculpture. Two, stylistically, it draws from diverse vocabularies. The mane of the lion is Assyrian in style. The forearms are Assyrian in style. The reaching to the heavens and roaring with an open mouth that you obviously can't see from this angle is neither Assyrian nor anything else. It's unique. It's, you might say, Israeli. And the third thing is that the fact of it being a public sculpture, when over the millennia dispersed Jewry had virtually no opportunity to produce public sculpture, and rarely were Jews interested in producing sculpture at all because it felt too idol-like. Paintings were a different story, illuminations a different story, drawings a different story, but statuary, I think, made more Jews feel more uncomfortable. And to repeat, in the public context, there was no context in which to do so. You're going to have to move. You're going to be expelled at some point. You're not going to put a sculpture. And the majority community doesn't want you to have a public statement in any case. So the fact that we have this public sculpture 14 years before the state exists is a statement: we are here to stay. And very quickly, the statuary and painting of what is in the process of evolving toward Israeli art becomes very varied. 4 years later, 4 years after Melnikov's work, Yitzhak Danziger does what is considered an iconic sculpture. It's not public. It's Nimrod, the hunter. Nimrod, the character who is associated in the rabbinic tradition with the building of the Tower of Babel. There's even a tradition that he somehow tried to destroy Abraham. And the point for Danziger was this was made of red Negev stone, so the material is of the land itself, and it reaches back not only into the Israelite past, but to the pre-Israelite past, the world of Canaan. And in fact, this was part of a group, he was part of a group that called themselves the Canaanites. We're eschewing 2 millennia of diasporic existence. We're thinking all the way back to the past of the past. By the way, what you cannot see is that his Nimrod, who is after all a pagan, is uncircumcised. And that horrified many viewers, as you can imagine. Nonetheless, this became very much a kind of icon. So fast forward to the main topic of our discussion, Benno Elkan, born in Germany, migrated to Britain in 1933 when Hitler came to power. He never set foot in the state of Israel in the course of his entire life. Melnikov came from elsewhere. Lillian came from elsewhere, but they came to Eretz Yisrael. Elkan never did. Nonetheless, he was very much taken up with the idea of Israel when the state came into being in 1948. So in 1956, on April 15th, on the 8th anniversary of independence, he sent this as a gift to the state of Israel to stand before the Knesset building, the building of the Israeli parliament. It's a bronze work. It's about 4.3 meters or about 14 feet high and about 3.5 meters or approximately 12 feet wide. He spent 10 years researching the story of the Jewish people in its multiple pasts. It's biblical, it's post-biblical, it's indigenous in Eretz Yisrael, it's diasporic, and created 29 different scenes in high relief that read from top to bottom with inscriptions such as the most important one from Zechariah 4:6, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. And he just overran it with extraordinary stuff. At the very base, you can see where the sixth and seventh, the six branches kind of meet together, is the Shema. And by the way, I'm obviously calling to your attention that his choice of subject was the seven-branch candelabra. So he reverted to that became the symbol of Israel itself, as we saw toward the outset of my remarks. So here's Shema Yisrael, Hero Israel, in a kind of halo. Hero Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And rising from it all kinds of images. The image of Moses with the tablets of the law, the beginning of Israelite peoplehood that is being recapitulated as Israeli peoplehood with the establishment of the state. Images of a series of Hebrew biblical prophets, such as Isaiah, whom you see here with the lion lying down with the lamb, such as Jeremiah, such as Ezekiel, whom you see here with this extraordinary vision, the valley of the bones, where the dead will rise from beneath the earth in the Messianic era and be refleshed. And of course, it's a symbol of the rebirth of the Jewish people itself after exile in Eretz Yisrael. So he has followed the line that began with Bezalel of thinking in terms of symbolic language. And in his case, the subject matter, to remind you again, sweeps from the biblical into the diasporic and eventuating back to Eretz Yisrael by way of the current existence of the state. And so we have any number of images that are post-biblical, but not quite, you might say, diasporic. So we have, for example, Ezra, who is the redactor of the Torah approximately a century after the return from the first exile from Babylonia and the rebuilding of the temple. And you have, on the other hand, the heroic Maccabees struggling against the Seleucids, who would have them destroy the sanctity of the temple by placing the image of Antiochus within it, which is part of a book, the Book of Maccabees, which, as you know, is not even part of the Bible that Jews consider biblical, although it's part of the Catholic and Orthodox Christian Bibles. It's also not part of the Protestant Bible. It's part of what we call Apocrypha. And then, of course, out into the diaspora, a whole series of different kinds of images. This one, rather, you might say abstract, is diasporic yearning, the dream of the return. So you have these figures who are reaching up both towards heaven and towards the image above them. You have images like that of the Golden Age of Spain with Yehuda Halevi, the poet. You have images such as this one, which is imagery from the Holocaust. But this is not just Holocaust victimization. This is the fighting back. This is the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto against the Nazis. And you have images that bring the Jews back. And this is the very base of the stem of the Torah, of the Menorah, rather. And it is the rebuilding of the land that we see here encapsulated. So Elkan creates this quintessential image derived from the quintessential Jewish image, which quintessential Jewish image was part of the question of what Jewish art is as a question of subject, symbol, style. Is it a matter of the artist's identity or the nature of the art? All of which fed into the question of how can we create a Jewish national art already at the beginning of the 20th century that then feeds further forward into the shaping of Israeli art, which is at the outset, particularly where statuary is concerned, an art that bespeaks the Jewish presence in the land not to be moved, speaks a relationship in that presence in terms of style and subject with the pre-diasporic past. And then we get to Elkan, who kind of weaves everything together, the diaspora, the pre-diaspora past, the return from the diaspora to the present, or rather what we might say is true of Israel in any case. It is a land of multiple pasts, a present, and questions always with regard to the future. So if we follow from Elkan in a series of oblique and then forward-moving directions, we find, for example, that if we look at a work by Mordechai Ardon, who had come also born in Poland, spent time studying at the Bauhaus in Germany, particularly influenced by his friend and neighbor, Paul Klee, who came in the 30s to Palestine, was not particularly taken with it, didn't want to stay at first. And then one night on Shavuot at midnight, a friend of his dragged him to the wall where he saw all of these people praying intensely because of that tradition that precisely at midnight, the heavens open up just above the site of the temple, and your ability to have your prayers heard by God is exponentially increased if you're there at that moment. He was so moved, he said, I realized I've been here before many, many times. I'll never leave again. And he became one of the quintessential leaders of what began to evolve as Israeli art. The Bezalel School that Schatz had founded closed for lack of funding in the middle of the 1930s, 1935. It reopened, and it was Ardon who later became the head of the Bezalel School in its middle phase, and then became the Minister of Education of the State of Israel. And this is a painting of his from 1962. It's called the Venus of Beersheba. And what he is doing is combining, as he always does, heaven and earth. You know, we've got this idea of a kind of semi-abstract heaven with these stars and planets, as it were, and even a kind of crescent moon. But then you realize the most obvious object here is this one. It's an archaeological object. It dates from about 3500 BCE, found in the area of the northern Negev near Beersheba, hence the Venus of Beersheba, because she is a pregnant figure and hence associated with fertility and hence associated with Venus. And so he's dug beneath the surface of the earth to dig beneath the surface of the pasts of Israel, even beyond Israelite, even beyond Hebrew, into Canaanite, to bring forward to the present this rather unique image that merges what's beneath the earth with the heavens themselves well beyond. Or by contrast, and I've taken half a chronological step backwards here, because this is actually a work from 1947, we have this wonderful painting by Johannan Simon, or Simon, and it's Sabbath on the kibbutz. So the idealized, quintessential aspect of what was evolving toward Israel well before Israel as a state existed was the kibbutz idea. Kibbutz from a Hebrew root meaning to gather together, to ingather. And the kibbutz, as you all probably know, is a farming community where everything functions collectively. So it's kind of an ideal fusion of socialist and democratic principles. And here we have Sabbath. So everybody is relaxing, lying around, sitting around, talking. It's complete kind of calm stasis. And they're all, of course, wearing that blue, which is associated with the Israeli flag, which is associated with the talit, which is associated with the heavens in this idyllic, idealized kind of landscape. But Israeli art, as it's evolving, evolves in an endless array of directions. This is a work from about 1955. So it's just around the time when Elkan was finishing up his Menorah to send it as a gift out of London, out of the diaspora to Israel. It's by Bergner, and it's called Golgotha. Now, Bergner is known for his surrealist work where, in lieu of people, he has these kitchen implements, right? This is a series of graters above and other kinds of kitchen implements below, which, of course, he then sort of functionally twists, turns, and it's as if they are like the Salvador Dali's clock, you know, just drooping rather than being solid. And he has them in all kinds of positions. I chose this one because aside from offering us Bergner at his surrealist weirdest, it's weirder than weird because of the subject matter. So Israeli art, this is Golgotha. Well, Golgotha, of course, is in Jerusalem. Golgotha is the site where Jesus was crucified. So the three figures we have here, these three graters hang on these pieces of wood or stand-in, so to say, for Jesus and the two thieves to either side of him, the good thief and the bad thief, all those Judeans who are his fans and all those Romans who are his enemies are gathered below also as kind of stylized kitchen implements. And the funny thing about Golgotha is no one knows exactly where it is. We understand it was outside of what Jerusalem was at that time in the early 30s CE under the Emperor Titus, under Pontius Pilate, the procurator that the Romans had in charge of Jerusalem and of Judea. So we know where it is, we don't know where it is. And of course, the beginning point, this event is the beginning point of what will evolve as a schism in Judaism that will yield Judaism and Christianity. And it's the beginning of the beginning in looking backwards of what will eventuate for Jews as a dispersion in which we will be an archipelago of minority islands within vast Christian and then later Muslim and other seas, in which our situation will be, well, often not so different from what Christians think about when they think of the situation of Jesus on that cross, hanged by the Romans, punished for his political subversion. Israeli art goes in all kinds of directions, and it wrestles with all kinds of pasts. So there is the biblical, there is the post-biblical. At the beginning of Judaism out of Judeanism, there is the diasporic with its ups and its downs, the golden age of Spain as an example that Elkan illustrated on his Menorah, and of course the Holocaust as the deepest, darkest moment among the dark moments of diasporic history. This is a rather interesting work by Micha Ullmann. It's more recent, 1995, and it was done in Berlin, in Bebelplatz. Bebelplatz was the place where the Nazis first started to burn books. And of course, Heinrich Heine, the early 19th century Jewish poet who converted to Judaism because it was simply too inconvenient to stay Jewish, converted from Judaism. It was simply too inconvenient to stay Jewish in the environment in which he lived. Although on his deathbed, he said it was the biggest mistake I ever made. Heine, in one of his plays, made the comment that where they burn books, they later burn people. Well, never was that truer than 145 years later in the Nazi era. And so in Bebelplatz, this work that is called Library is a Holocaust memorial. And what he's done is dug into the earth, very different from Ardon's vision of digging into the earth of the northern Negev, into the earth of Bebelplatz in Berlin. And you can see that he has created an installation of empty bookshelves. And it's not only, of course, that he's playing on the idea of book burning, so the books are gone. And if I were delivering this talk in Florida, I'd say this is particularly relevant. But of course, there are other places in the United States where it's relevant today as well. They're empty shelves. You can look down at them. It's illuminated. There's a plexi thing to protect it, of course. You can even step on it if you want or need to. But it's not only a pun on the burning of books and later the burning of Jews, but of course, Jews as the people of the book, as Muhammad first labeled us. But our shelves here are stripped. And it's also, therefore, a kind of reminder to us, to Jews, to, in his case, us Israeli Jews, that if we forget who we were and who we are, and only attach ourselves to some aspect of what we have experienced, such as the Holocaust, then we cease to be fully three-dimensional. We cease to be what we are. So the question, or the statement, rather, made by the public statuary that abounds in Israel and begins to abound even before the state exists, that we are here to stay, is starting to give way in the course of the 70s, 80s, and 90s among many Israeli artists to the question of, but what exactly, who exactly are we who are staying here? We go from beneath the earth up into the heavens. And I jump back to about 1980, where there's this wonderful statue by Ezra Orion, right to the west of Jerusalem, in the valley that is between Jerusalem proper and where you continue to where the Israel Museum is. And it's called Ma'alot. Ma'alot means ascents. And it's actually made of concrete and industrial materials. It's steps, it's literal steps from an industrial site that he's cobbled together to create this enormous ascent. And the idea, of course, is again a sort of pun. On the one hand, a song of ascents. That's what you find again and again as the opening phrase in all of the 150 Psalms that are ascribed to, associated with King David. And these, of course, are songs of praise. That's why we call them Psalms. In Hebrew, Tehillim, praise songs to God, and discussions of God and God's relationship to us. But it also plays on the idea visually of a ladder. And when one thinks of a ladder to heaven, one cannot not think about much earlier than David, almost a millennium before David, Jacob, and his dream when he first went out of Canaan into exile, into the wilderness, ultimately to Haran, because he feared the furor of his brother Esau, who eventually 20 years later came back and, of course, had another event where he wrestled all night long, and at the end of which he was no longer called Jacob the heel grabber, he was called Yisrael, one who has striven, one who has wrestled with God. So Orion's work, this abstract work, puns and plays on various angles and aspects of aspiration that are part and part of what Israel has been throughout its 75 years of history, and already was becoming half a century before its technical history as a state began. What we might call Israeli art goes in all kinds of directions. Many Israeli artists, many Israeli art historians say, well, you know, ritual art, ceremonial art, that sort of stuff, that's Jewish, but that's not Israeli. But the fact of the matter is, you have Israeli artists who make ritual art. This is one of my favorite Chanukiot. It's made by Janet Berg in 1992. She's actually born in America. She came to study in Israel and stayed. By the way, is Israeli art made by an Israeli? What does that mean? Do I have to live in Israel? Can I be an Israeli who no longer lives in Israel, but I was born in Israel? Can I be someone who came from elsewhere, where so many did, particularly at the beginning, but so too Janet Berg so much later? Can I even be Benno Elkan, who never set foot in Israel, and yet creates the work which is the quintessential symbol of the state? Well, anyway, this Chanukia is called an educational Chanukia chinuchit, because it is overrun with inscriptions, it's overrun with ideas, it's fraught with a whole vocabulary of the rabbinic discussion of what Hanukkah is all about. And among the other aspects of its imagery, of course, you get the very clear sense of that seven-branch menorah that is also there, because I remind you, the miracle of Hanukkah in the tale we tell about it from the book of Maccabees that we don't read as Bible, but the story from which we tell the story of the book of Maccabees, the miracle found in Maccabees 2 is oil that needed to be used to repurify, to rekindle rather, the seven-branch menorah, had to be the right kind of oil. And once the temple had been rededicated, which is what Chanukah means, dedication, once it had been purified and rededicated, and the menorah was to be rekindled, there was just a little bit of oil, enough to last for a day. And yet the story is it lasted for the 8 days needed to produce enough to continually keep that menorah, an eternal flame, a symbol of God's eternal presence among us, kindled. Hence we celebrate Hanukkah, of course, for 8 days. So the menorah of the temple, which is the seven-branch candelabrum, is embedded here in her Chanukiah, which is a Hanukkah menorah that is intended, as I said, to be an educational one with all kinds of instruction. Particularly in the last couple of decades, we have found in the world of Israeli artists that new questions have emerged. And enlarging this, you get a sense of it, even though I know it's going to be a little bit blurry. This is from a series done in 2010 by the Israeli artist, born, grew up in Israel, spent a lot of time in different parts of the world, teaching and doing art, but she is actually the head of the glass department at Bezalel. So we've come full circle back to where it began, Bezalel, in its third iteration as an art school that has expanded in all kinds of directions. And her name is Daphne Kafeman. And as I said, this is 2010. It's part of a series of 6 different works. Under glass, you can see there are little dried flowers and plants, and there is thread, and there is an inscription, And she has then provided each of these 6 to an Israeli soldier to come up with the drawing that will become part of the artwork. So it's kind of kibbutz-like, it's collaborative between her and these different soldiers. In this particular case, the soldier was Yoav Weinberg. And the inscription says, "But I have come to detest life," right? That's what's written there in Hebrew. And she has given no indication as to where the phrase comes from. And the soldier chose to create two men in a loving embrace. Is that a comment on homophobia in the Israeli army? Is it a comment about homophobia in general? Is it a comment about, because detesting life in the context of male-male love, is that what it's about? It's not clear, because she's left it intentionally unclear. What's unclear even to the soldier artist is where the inscription comes from. It comes from an article that was written in Haaretz, one of the Israeli newspapers, in which a would-be suicide bomber, a Palestinian, who at the last minute changed his mind, defused himself, so to speak, and was captured and was interviewed. He said, I had a girlfriend, she was a year younger than I. My family was going to propose to her family that we get married, but I had come to detest life. And that's when he decided to become a suicide bomber. And something changed him and changed his perspective. But the point of the works of art, of which this is one, is to think the question of Israel in terms not only of itself, in terms of its relationship internally to its Jewish population, to its non-Jewish population, to the Palestinian non-Jewish population within Israel and beyond Israel. And these are the kinds of things that many more Israeli artists in the last 25, 30, 35 years have been thinking about and addressing. Here's another work. It's an untitled work by Eli Gur-Aryeh, done in 2003. And what you can see he's done is, out of plastic, this gun, he's embedded it in a cloud of earth with grass and so on. And he's kind of treating the gun, on the one hand, as a kind of archaeological artifact. Think back to the Venus of Beersheba, dug out from underneath the soil after 55 centuries. This is a gun that is obviously of recent advent. What do you find when you dig under the soil of Israel? What do you find when you dig through its pasts? How real, how tragically ever present is the matter of violence, the matter of guns. And from our perspective, when I say our, I mean our American perspective, it seems to me there's an irony here. I was in Israel just a month ago, and there was a question as to whether I would be permitted to take the group of students that I had with me to the West Bank, to Hebron and Bethlehem, because of concern for violence that was happening. And when that objection was raised, I said, on Georgetown's campus, some guy could show up and 16 students could get killed tomorrow. The danger of gun violence is realer in America than it is anywhere else on the planet. So the fact that you're reading headlines about the violence in the northern West Bank, or the protests in Tel Aviv against the government, all of these issues wrapped around the sensibility and context of Americans and our experience from a different angle of violence, just makes for a whole array of things to think about that are part and parcel, and this leads me to my last image, of the strangeness of a state that in the course of its 75 years of existence has never experienced absolute peace within and without its borders, but at the same time, which has more and more become, in an odd way, what Herzl had dreamed of at the beginning, which is, why did he want there to be a Jewish state, a Judenstaat? He was looking for some way to normalize Jewish existence that in diaspora had been so abnormal across time and space. And this image by Adines, a photographer from the 2006 or so, is called Abraham, untitled, in parenthesis, Abraham and Isaac. So he's brought us back to, played on the image of, the idea of Abraham and Isaac, perhaps, shall we say, in a moment what one might imagine on the way up in Genesis 22 to Mount Moriah, where Isaac is going to be offered, or is it on the way back down after Isaac has been miraculously redeemed by divine intervention, but they go their separate ways? Read carefully where the end of Genesis 22 and the beginning of Genesis 23 lead. Isaac goes back to his mother. Abraham goes elsewhere and doesn't ever see Sarah again while she's alive. He comes back there to bury her after her death. But what we've got, of course, is an image of a homeless man and his presumed son, kind of half dozing in what is their home, this carriage that moves around the streets with all their worldly belongings. Israel is not only the ideal that we saw, for example, in the Kibbutz Shabbat by Johannan Simon. It's not only the weirdness that Bergner gives us with his surreal kitchen implements. It's not only the magnificent aspiration that Ezra Orion gives us with that sculpture of Ma'alot. It's not only the carefully considered and well thought out teaching Chanukiah that Janet Berg gives us. It's the kind of questions that Daphne Kaufman was starting to ask, the kind of questions that Eli Gur Aryeh was asking. And what Adi Nas has given us is, it's normal. It has homeless people. So it has achieved what Herzl hoped for, but in so doing, it has raised all kinds of questions, not about whether we are here to stay, because that's no longer a question. The question is, where are we going? Who are we? What are we? What is our relationship from those multiple paths through the present to the future with ourselves and with those who live among us and next door to us, with whom we still have unresolved issues? Thank you all very much. And I believe we are open for questions, if there are any questions. And I see from the chat that I think there are. Rachel, the floor is yours to be the asker.
Thank you so much. I'm waiting for the questions to come in. It definitely, we had comments how complex and full of information your presentation is. And so the question was whether we are recording the session and whether it can be revisited in order to...
Not only we're recording it, but did Rachel mention at the beginning that there's an exam next week? Everyone who signed on will get an exam.
And Marilyn says, thank you, Ori, for including those who live next door to us, which, yes, of course. I was wondering, you presented a very wide definition of Israeli art. So is that in accordance with Bezalel School of Art? Do they see it the same way, or do they have a more narrow?
Yeah, I will be honest. In my experience, I find most people don't ask the questions I ask. I had a long, ongoing discussion years ago with Bezalel Narkis, who was the son of Mordechai Narkis, who founded the Israel Museum as part of the Bezalel School back, in Schatz's day. And Narkis said, Israeli art is art made by, Jewish art is art made by a Jew. And I said, I don't think it's that simple. What if someone converts to Judaism, converts from Judaism, and so on? So the shaping of Israeli art that starts out as a kind of subset of the question, what is Jewish national art, which starts out as a vocabulary of symbols, of style, of subject, even of substance, like Danziger's Nimrod is made of the stone from the Negev, is a starting point. In the end, it doesn't answer the question, what is Jewish art? It opens up the question of what will become Israeli art, both because it's half a century before there's Israel, and because once you get to the state of Israel, you still have You have artists who come from elsewhere. You have artists who were born there. You have artists who were born there and spend most of their careers away from Israel. I interviewed Danny Caravan back in 1984 in Paris in the studio. He said, look, I carry some bullets in me from the War of Independence. So I carry Israel in a very particular way wherever I am, and I'm Israeli. My vocabulary is Israeli. My language is Hebrew. And, conversely, as I said, you have someone, let's say like Janet Berg, or earlier figures who were born elsewhere who moved to Israel. And you have someone like Benno Elkan himself who never set foot in Israel. So my long-winded answer to your question is, I do believe that it is a complex question without a simple answer. And I'm not sure that in modern Bezalel, they're so busy producing all kinds of art that I'm not sure how much thinking they actually do about it. When I interviewed also in 1984, Amnon Barzel, who at the time was arguably the most important, art historian, art critic in Israel, he said, well, ritual, ceremonial, that sort of stuff, that's Jewish, that's not Israeli. And he talked about how young Israeli artists reflect on early Israeli artists. So behind him was a painting, this was 84, by a young artist, and it was a painting of the Danziger Nimrod. So the Nimrod had become iconic, so now you have artists reflecting on earlier artists. But the thing about Israeli art is it can be so reflective in so many different ways on the multiple past and on the present. So it's there. Not to advertise, but I have a book that's coming out shortly called Between Pasts and Future, a conceptual history of Israeli art, precisely because there are a number of books on Israeli art, but it's art made by Israeli artists almost always without sort of asking what makes it Israeli. And we're not even asking the question of whether by Israeli we mean someone born or not born here, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's kind of a long-winded non-answer answer to your question.
I'm getting scared of the next question. So, so we have a few application of future students of yours, and the exam question, a joke was also took off here. Serious question: when is the book coming out?
I'm hoping within the next couple of months. The publisher is Generous, Generis, Generous Publishers, but I'm not quite sure. I just delivered the manuscript literally yesterday, so I'm not sure how long, but their process tends to be a little bit quicker than my experience has been with other publishers. So we'll see, but it should be in the next couple of months anyway. I did see two questions with my own eyes, which I don't know if you're going to get to. One is, yes, you can use your daughter. You can cheat. She can help you on the exam. And two, apropos of Palestinian art, I am editing an issue of an arts journal about the Middle East and the arts. So I have someone who has been writing on Israeli art, someone who's writing on Iranian art, someone who's writing on Egyptian, Turkish, Palestinian. And it's specifically, how these countries are, how artists in these different countries reflect on politics in different ways over the last 150 years. There is a book by Ganit Ankori, but she's Israeli. Actually, she lives in Massachusetts now, on Palestinian art. There are increasing numbers of Palestinian art historian / critics writing on Palestinian art. And you would not be surprised to hear that Palestinian art is often, not always, because you have Palestinian artists who work abstractly, and that's their preference, but very often political and reflects on the Palestinian condition in various and sundry ways. Both by Palestinian, I mean Palestinian artists living in the West Bank or Gaza, but also Palestinian Israeli artists who have lived within the Green Line of pre-67 whose families go back to 48 and never left. They've been in Israel. And after 2003 in Oslo began to rethink their identities as Palestinian Israeli as opposed to Israeli or as opposed to Palestinian. And a lot of artists. There's an art gallery now that is available. There have been Palestinian artists whose work has been exhibited in the last 10 or 12 years, actually, in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. No, both, Israel Museum as well. So that's a whole burgeoning area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one question about the statue of the lion. Where is that located? I think it's in the Galilee, right?
Yes, it's Tel Chai. It's the very, very north, the northern tip.
Okay. So Gita is asking, thank you. Gita is asking, do you think Yossel Bergner is a devotee of Dali?
I suspect he was well aware of Dali. Certainly that part for which Dali is most famous, which is these drooping clocks and the like, because that was so much his Bergner's signature, these kind of drooping kitchen utensils. But he's got one where he's got this greater kind of going down the center of the street. It's like John Wayne in a Western, and he's got other things as well that don't go that way. Where there is a much more direct reference to the tragic side of Israel's war-torn history. He was also, by the way, the one who was a neighbor of Shalom of Safed, who encouraged him to become the artist that Shalom Moskowitz, from being a clock fixer, became. So a very interesting kind of guy, Bergner, aside from his art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Someone do you know where his art is?
All over the place. In Sfat, I think he's no longer alive, but there's still a gallery. But his stuff is in Tel Aviv Museum of Art, but it's also, I think he's got a piece or two in Museum of Modern Art in New York. I'm not 100% certain of that. And a lot of private collections all over the place.
Yeah. Ahara is asking, does Israeli art include water-based created art?
Oh, absolutely. Going back to the 70s, actually, it's art that focuses on the land itself. And so there was a project, for example, by an artist named Joshua Neustein it was the late 70s or early 80s, in which what he did was, in a very dry wadi, he set up loudspeakers in different places, and then you turn them on and there's the rush of water. So he created water, as it were, audio-wise, but there ain't no water there, running through the wadi. Of course, it's a wadi that during the spring could fill with water in a flash flood. So he's someone who immediately comes to mind, but there have been a number of artists who are involved in eco-environmental art projects going back, as I said, to the 70s, and even more so today, yes.
Mm-hmm. So Eliana, but that's not a question, it's a statement. Eliana says that there's a Palestinian art show at Aina Museum now.
Yes, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reminding us. That's correct.
So that's for those who are in Israel, it's definitely.
For those of you who don't know, Ein Harod is just south of Haifa, and it was an arts community, a kind of arts collective established by Marcel Janko, who is a Romanian and very important as a founder of the Dada movement. So he brought Dadaism to Eretz Yisrael when he arrived, and it's just exploded. There were several hundred inhabitants who are full-time at Ein Harod, artists in various media, and by the way, not only in necessarily visual media. And it's a terrific place to visit. They've got, of course, a museum, but you also have all these individual galleries and homes. And if you're in Israel, go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gita is asking, are you acquainted with the work of Schwalbe?
No, I'm not. Tell me. Well, write me. I'm not.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm
See
not.
for answer. And Jane says she loves this as an LA resident who got a BA in design at UCLA. She's recently retired and would love to study for a master's in this field. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, there is the Jewish Art Center, which was founded by Bezalel in Jerusalem. There was an MA program it was Jewish Museum in association, I think, with Jewish Theological Seminary, and possibly, I may be misremembering this part, with Columbia. Anyway, in New York, I'm not sure if it still exists, but those are, Jewish art programs. I don't remember, I'm pretty sure Bezalel at this point gives master theses, and I think you can study at Bezalel for a master's in art history. I may be wrong about that, as opposed to getting an MFA, which is of course a different kind of game. So that's off the top of my head, all that occurs to me. And only the Jewish Art Center of Jerusalem that I mentioned, I know for fact, is up and running. I'm not certain about the other two.
Mm-hmm. Great. So that's important leads. Fabulous. Yep. So there's a question about Ein Harod. I don't see any more questions here. Oh, yes. Baron Hamel, who's actually the granddaughter of Benno Elkan, says, thank you for your wonderful presentation and such interesting comments about Benno's Menorah. I always learn something new from you. So that is beautiful.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's extraordinary work, obviously. And, interestingly, he did a couple of menorahs in London, but in both Jewish and Christian contexts before he got to this project as kind of lead-ins with biblical scenes and stuff. There is one or two in Westminster Cathedral. So he established himself as a bronze sculptor of ideas, is the way I put it, even before he undertook this project. So yeah, quite interesting. I also find interesting that just somehow, of course, it was not as easy to travel in the 50s and 60s as it is now, that he actually never visited Israel. Just didn't happen. And I don't even know enough detail to know whether he had hoped to or had plans to do so and it just didn't happen, or whether it never occurred to him that he needed to, because his contribution came very comfortably from a distance.
Yeah. We'll have to find out, Baron. Maybe she types an answer. And somebody says here, do look into Schweibe. It's actually the artist's name. He combines biblical and contemporary images on canvas. For example, David dancing before the ark at the then Kikar Zion. And
he's Israeli, or he's in Israel, I presume. And it's a he. I'm also assuming from the.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. I shall. I very much shall.
Yeah. Okay. So Baron is writing back. There are two menorahs two candelabras in Westminster, Old and New Testament.
Yep, that's what I said.
Yes, exactly. And two in Buckfast Abbey in England. So yeah. So very strong London presence post-war. Wonderful. Thank you so much. This was really a sweeping introduction into Israeli art, and a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much, Ori.